On the topic that all artists should receive a percentage of the resale value of their work, we welcome the first affirmative speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we say that the status quo is characterised by a hugely unbalanced negotiation between art speculators and artists, which sees on one side speculators who have incredible access to capital and who have very sophisticated knowledge of the art market and what is likely to occur in the future. And on the other side of that negotiation, you have poor and struggling artists who often don't have a substantial or regular income and who need to get their art into the market in order to build up that fame, in order to be able to access that income in the future. We say that negotiation is critically and problematically unbalanced, and our model is going to fix that balance and recognise that both individuals participating in that negotiation deserve something. So what are we going to do? In the same way we do with copyright law in most countries, we say artists will retain a proprietary interest in their work for a substantial period of time, which varies from, let's say, like 50 to 100 years, depending on a particular jurisdiction. We think countries are best placed to decide that. Secondly, we say there'll be an art registry in a similar way to the fact that you go and register a patent with a particular office of the government, where you can go and register your work and it is coded so that we know exactly what it is into the future, and all sales will be done through that registry. And thirdly, we say that during that period where you still have a proprietary interest in that work, you'll receive between 5 and 10%, again, depending on the particular jurisdiction. I'm going to bring you 3 arguments in this debate. And the first one is going to talk to you about why we think artists actually deserve a percentage of the resale value of their artwork. And the first reason is because people's creativity should actually be rewarded proportionate to the value that that has to consumers. We say, however, that value is incredibly difficult to predict at the point that you sell that art early on in your career. A couple of reasons why. First, because it fluctuates according to the taste of the public, which changes over time and develops. Secondly, because it's determined by the rarity of your work and also the other market competitors and the rarity of their work. But thirdly, because it's continually influenced by the other work that you do and the fame that you accrue over your career. We think that means that at the point at which you sell your art, the value is not accurately predicted. I think it means that it's incredibly difficult for people to trade art at an appropriate value from the beginning of their career. And we think that's especially true for people who don't have a substantial amount of fame and support in the early parts of their career. For example, Indigenous artists, who we think are an incredible beneficiary of our model. We say that creativity should be rewarded no matter how long it takes for that creativity to be realised by the market, and that's something that our model does. So let's talk about why we think that these people deserve continued repatriation for their work. Because we say their continued work determines the value of the individual's property. So if I buy a piece of art and I want to resell that in the future, the artist who I bought that work from initially continues to do work in their career, and I benefit directly from the continued work of that individual because my piece of art becomes substantially more profitable. I think because of that fact, I should actually give them some money. They should have a stake in the work they sold me initially. But the reason why we think that speculators actually don't deserve all of the profits from when they resell this stuff is because we think they purchased this art at an unfairly low rate, which was in fact below market value. Here's a couple of reasons why. First, because they have huge amounts of money and huge amounts of knowledge, which is far superior to that of individual artists in that negotiation, which often means they know and can predict that that art is going to become incredibly valued to a much greater extent than that individual artist. Second, because they often take advantage of the needs of that artist for direct cash in the short term to continue their career and to continue making art, which means that they can make them sell it to them for under the value that they know that it's worth. And we think thirdly, this is characterised by people who actually have a short-term incentive to make profit, and that means those individuals aren't in the best position to predict what's going to happen in the long term. We say for that reason, speculators advantage from the situation in terms of that negotiation, and therefore they should give back to those artists. We think that makes a lot of sense. But let's talk about why this is actually important for artists. And we say that the popularised notion of artists is actually quite true, that they're often incredibly poor. They often struggle to make a very substantial income. They often have to hold incredibly shitty jobs on the side so they can actually fund the materials they use to paint a painting. We say that's incredibly problematic. They give up years of their life, they put in substantial amounts of emotional energy into creating these pieces of art. We say they should be rewarded for doing that. But we say also the state has an interest in protecting artists and in continuing incentivising people to take up the actual career of art, which we think right now is incredibly difficult by virtue of the way the current system works, because we think diversity and the production of art is incredibly good and socially utile. We think it's important to the cultural standing of particular people. We think people really enjoy viewing it, and so the state has an interest in making sure that people are continually able to become artists, are able to continue to function as artists into the future. And for all of those things to occur, these people have to be able to get an income from actually producing that art. We say our model will provide that to these artists, and that's incredibly important. And finally, let's look at why this protects the art market as a whole. We say that it is difficult for painters, as I told you, to know what the market value is of their work, which means they sell their paintings, often their best paintings, which they've put in years and years of work to, in the early parts of their career in order to make a profit. We think what that means in the long run is that they're often forced in later parts of their career to generate a whole heap of paintings to try and make the types of profits which would be equivalent to what they're seeing their original painting sold for on the market. And we think a great example of this is Salvador Dali, who went through, once his clocks painting was selling for like $25 million, or has been valued at around that, and started selling off initial sketches of the painting and duplicates of that painting, and a whole host of other sketchbooks and things like that, in order to try and make the profit that he thought he was entitled to. I think that has a couple of really problematic outcomes. First, we think it decreases the value of the initial art once you start to duplicate it, once you start to go through this entire process, which is bad for not only that individual, but also the speculator. But secondly, we said that it's bad for art overall, because once this person is in the position where they need to seek profit from that art, it changes the type of art they're likely to produce. It means that the art becomes not about what is the best art and what is the most socially valuable stuff. It becomes about what is most likely to be purchased and taken up by the art market. We think that's incredibly problematic. We think our model provides artists the freedom in the rest of their career to have a continual income from the work that they produced earlier in their career, which means they can continue to be an artist, they can continue to produce art, but better still, they can continue to produce art which doesn't need to necessarily be profitable, it doesn't need to necessarily target the things that people want to purchase so much as be socially valuable and socially utile. We think that's an incredibly big benefit of our model. We say that our model changes fundamentally the negotiating, which we think is entirely off balance. We say that artists need to be protected and the status quo does nothing to ensure that their interests are represented. But moreover, it ensures that creativity continues to happen. It ensures that individuals continue to take up the job of becoming an artist, which we say is an incredibly risky job as it stands now. We think that has value for individual artists, we think it has value for speculators, and we think it has value for society as a whole. We're very, very happy to change this balance.
Thank you. We'd now like to invite the first negative speaker.
When Apple started producing iPods, iPods weren't as cool as they are now. And now, people with Apple devices benefit from the coolness that surrounds all of those Apple products, and Apple products, as a result, have gone up. But we don't say that Apple has a right to the money that is now paid as a premium because their products have become cool, because that was surrounding the initial sale which they put in place, and it's exactly the same as in art scenarios. If someone paints a prestigious painting, they benefit in the future from that prestige, and they've made a fair bargain at the point of sale in the initial point, and they continue to benefit from that prestige. So what we support on side negative is that artists have the right to the original sale of the physical production of their work, which is the status quo in most countries. Once they have made that sale, the buyer gets the right, and whoever owns it can sell it for whatever they like without having to pay anything back to the original artist. Obviously, the artist also has a right of refusal. So what I'm going to talk about first is the issue that we have in terms of the problem that I've set up, and we think that people do sell art at a fair price. Secondly, I'm going to look at the parity between creative endeavour and commercial endeavour by the two different actors, which I alluded to in my introduction. And finally, I'm going to look at the dynamics of the modern art market and how they actually discriminate against the incentives operating on art dealers to flourish art industries and to get more art in the areas on the ground. First of all, though, some points of response. And the first one is to talk about the imbalance, because they never actually set this aside as a point. They only gave it as an introductory point, that there was obviously going to be an imbalance, they thought, between the capital of the dealers and the poor artists. They never analysed this to any degree, which is why it falls away very, very quickly, when we realise that investors can't take that capital anywhere. So they have a lot of capital, but the problem is they don't have to back up that capital any other production options. If they want art from a specific artist, they can't go elsewhere to get it, so the capital only goes directly to that artist. It's like any other investor industry, so all we can assume is they would never allow someone to buy something off someone else who is poorer than them. They've never given us any analysis there. Artists can hold a monopoly of profit over their particular art, and so the investors don't have an unfair balance. Second point of response is about the changing value, and basically their analysis went like this. The value of art almost always goes up, and so dealers get an unfair benefit out of the sale. The problem is they also accepted that the value of art could go down, and so the trade-off that the dealers make when they buy that art is that it might go up or it might go down, and that's the trade-off that anyone makes when they buy a car, or when they buy a house, when they buy anything else where the value is not set in stone for the future. So they accepted that the value could go down, therefore the dealers don't have an imbalance there. But secondly, a lot of the time we say when the prestige goes up, the artist then trades off on that prestige in the future. So even if they don't benefit from their original painting, the prestige with which that painting gains them, the prestige that painting gains them, is the prestige that they profit off in the long term. So that's the third point of response about poor artists. If you are successful, your prestige from that original success means that you can benefit from that prestige in the future and you have something new to trade off. But just like Apple, we don't allow you to go back and reprice all of your products or to get new profits from the things that you've already sold in order to gain that prestige. The second problem, though, in talking about poor artists, was a problem that they had, because on the one hand they wanted there to be more art in the public domain, but on the other hand they seem to have a problem with the fact that prestige in the future incentivises artists to continue to produce, and to put out sketches and to put out heaps more art. Because if you have prestige from your original sale, then their analysis went like this. You're going to start sketching stuff, you're going to start painting heaps of stuff at the end of your career. Absolutely. The prestige then allows you to trade off that prestige, to continue to produce art, and to continue to have benefits in the future. If you don't allow people to do that, and you give Picasso an infinite monopoly over the profits of his original painting, he has far less incentive to continue painting, but they wanted more art in the public domain. Okay, 3 points that we're going to give you. Well, the first of the 3 points starts like this. It's addressing why we think there is no problem. Obviously, I've done a significant amount of this work in my rebuttal, but I'm going to continue to do so that we can flatten it entirely. First point of response is to talk about why artists have an advantage at sale. And again, this is the analysis that goes like this. Good artists have the advantage of a prestige premium that's sought after. It means that at the point of sale, people will be looking for artists who, yes, might do well in the future, but those artists can trade that off. There's no other artist that might be able to paint that same painting. That painting is in their mind, and that means that if there is a capital imbalance, there's also an idea and brilliance at art imbalance, which is fine. They meet in the middle, and that's what happens in all artistic endeavours. We think there's a benefit there. The second thing, though, is when you sell your artwork, you don't actually sell your personal talent, right? You're not selling your talent, so your talent should be something that they don't own, and given that they don't own your talent, they should be able to buy your physical artwork and profit off that however they see fit. You continue to own your talent, and you continue to profit from that. The third thing, though, is artists actually have the benefit of scarcity, because they can say, I will not produce more artwork unless you give me a better price for my second painting, because guess what? The first one made you heaps and heaps of money, and maybe we didn't agree fairly in the past. We don't concede that that will be the case, but if that is the case, they can hold scarcity over people in the future, and they will continue to do that if they are beneficial artists. The second point to make here is why art might go up after the artist has sold it, but that might not actually be due to any effort that the artist has put in themselves, and therefore they deserve no benefit from the art going up. And there are 3 points to make here. The first one is art often goes up after death, and it's the fact of death of Picasso that made his art go up. And that wasn't any benefit that he deserved to pull away from that art. It was just something that happened in the world that meant that his art value went up. He has no benefit to due from that. And death promises scarcity, and at that point the art goes up. But in his life, while those things are being sold, he doesn't deserve any benefit from that. The second thing, though, that they've never understood is that art dealers add value all of the time to art. Art dealers have a skill in finding particularly rich buyers. Art dealers have a skill in promoting the prestige of artists, and there's a very, very high search cost, a search cost which poor artists would never be able to meet. So the art dealers themselves add value and deserve to benefit from that value add. And finally, art picks up its value due to who it's been owned by in the future. So if it's owned by a wealthy baron 100 years ago, it picks up artistic value completely regardless of the original value at which it was sold at. Second point of analysis then is about the parity between creative endeavour of commercial and artistic actors. And here, essentially, we're talking about Apple versus Picasso. So, the property conception, first of all, is that when people sell something, they sell the physical instantiation of that good, but they don't sell the idea, they sell the idea itself in its physical instantiation. The effect of this, though, is that when they sell the good, they extinguish all rights of the physical thing, but they never extinguish the rights that they have to their prestige itself, which means they can continue to benefit in the long term. So if we take Ferrari, for instance, Ferrari make a lot of Ferraris, and that means that Ferrari can sell those Ferraris, but they have no rights to the resale value of Ferraris because they've also made them seem cool because of the way that their family acts, because of the benefits to Ferraris in the long term. And we don't allow Ferrari to continue straight off on the long-term coolness of Ferraris. People can sell Ferraris absolutely as they like. In exactly the same way, Picasso shouldn't benefit in the future from the way that people resell his paintings. And in fact, his family can benefit from that prestige by setting up museums, by setting up their own art dealerships, by funding other artists. They can do all of that things that people do in the commercial sphere, but the problem is that they haven't been able to demonstrate on side Affirmative why there is any difference between that commercial sphere and the artistic sphere. The final point to talk about then is the dynamics of the modern art market, and this is crucial because we think they actually impose a capital gains tax on art dealers who no longer have as strong an incentive to go out, or as strong an ability to go out and search for really, really good artists. So, under the status quo, art dealers often, yes, we don't know exactly how strong art will be perceived in the public domain, which means that they need to go out and search for a lot of art, and they have a high cost in doing that, but they pay off that high cost from the few pieces of artwork that they sell. What they do is that they absolutely undermine the public benefit of art dealers having an incentive to go and promote art on the ground, promote understanding of art, pay artists who might not always pay off to be really, really good artists, because they impose a capital gains tax, which makes that all the harder to do. So if you're an art dealer and you don't know whether art will trade off well in the future, you're losing 10% of all of your profits in the art that does trade off well, which makes it far, far harder for you to then fuel the rest of the industry which could succeed or which could fail, and there's a harm there. That side of the house accepts that they want more art in the public domain. If art dealers are able to do what they do under the status quo, more art will be in the public domain. More poor artists who might not even be good artists will get the ability to showcase themselves, and if you discriminate against art dealers, they will not get that ability. The point that side of the house needs to understand is that when Picasso doesn't make much off his first painting, he sells a lot more paintings to pay off the prestige that has been earned. That is a benefit. We stand in opposition.
Previous speaker, and welcome the second speaker from the Affirmative.
Well, from the first negative speech, ladies and gentlemen, you could be forgiven for assuming we'd never done this for any market before, as if it wasn't equivalent to what we do with patent law, as if it wasn't equivalent to what we do with music, as if it wasn't equivalent to what we do with writers, when we say that when your books are sold, regardless of the publishing house that has bought the rights to your work, you still get some benefit from the creative efforts that you put into that book. That doesn't mean that publishing houses have stopped buying books. It doesn't mean that recording studios have stopped seeking out artists. They still do all of those things because the royalties that they pay are disproportionate to the profit that they still gain. The reality in this debate is this was not about slamming art collectors and art speculators as horrible, horrible people. It was about balancing them and their needs against the needs of artists who were getting nothing
for the creative efforts that they put in early in their career that established their fame that they accepted existed. I'm going to talk in my speech about what this does for forgeries and what benefits we gain there. But I want to talk about 3 points of rebuttal first. Firstly, can artists be the perfect market actors the Victoria 1 loves so much? Seb firstly said, this is like saying you can't buy from poor people, because whenever there's a disadvantage, presumably this analysis would apply. No, it's substantially more nuanced than that. It's like saying that you can't buy something that is hard to value at the time of your purchase in a way that is inherently exploitative of someone who is almost inevitably relatively poor and desperate and has limited other income sources without some safeguards for that person. This is not taking away the 90% of benefit those art collectors still got under our model. It was simply bouncing some of that benefit back to the people who enabled it in the first place. In the same way that Apple has patents that mean that the things it created to create iPods are still beneficial to it and the scientists who created them. That is what we set up. Seb then said, well, it doesn't really matter because they don't really need this, because they can be perfect market actors by realising that selling things early means that they establish fame later in life, which they can then profit off by selling more things. That assumes that paintings work exactly like iPods, that you can duplicate them and roll them off machinery and get the same value that your early work got. The reality is we know that isn't the case. The reality is that when you try and duplicate those efforts that made you famous in the first place, that frequently doesn't work. So in order to protect those individuals, you need to protect them for that initial stage. Seb then said, but they have a monopoly over their talent. They could just not sell to those art collectors. Fine, then those art collectors with large amounts of resources will find another desperate artist who is willing to sell and make that person the next Picasso instead. You don't have a choice. If you want to enter the market and sell your art and become famous, you can't do it by hoarding it in your basement. So your capacity to monopolise over your fame in the future is very, very low. The capacity to monopolise your talent is very, very low because your desperation weighs that out. And even if you're someone who genuinely is convinced you're the next Picasso, you still have to sell your artwork, because if no one sees it, you never become famous, and then you never get the benefit of selling that artwork in the future. So you don't have a choice, even if you are perfectly able to judge the market value of your work, something which we think most artists can't. Secondly, in terms of rebuttal, does this give artists too much control over the value of their work into the future? Okay, the first thing we say is 5 to 10% is not too much control. And the second thing that we say is that often you are balancing that against other people who've contributed. So in the same way that we say recording labels get the benefit of having invested in a music group, but that music group still gets the benefit of rights over their songs and the ability to collect royalties from those songs, we think this is, again, the correct balance. But Seb said, often their fame isn't caused by that artist. It's just things like the fact that they died and then people heard about them and they got famous. Or, perhaps more importantly and more relevantly, those art collectors invested in promoting that image to promote the value of that artwork. That belies the reality that the artist is doing all of those things as well. That belies the reality that both are actors and both deserve to benefit to varying degrees, which is why our model set a percentage and why the topic set a percentage as opposed to 100%. Okay, finally. Would this reduce investment in the art market? And this was one of their biggest pushes. The idea that investors will be unwilling to invest in the same number of those artists. Okay, firstly and empirically, we haven't seen that with things like patent law, we haven't seen that with things like authors, we haven't seen that with things like music groups. Maybe artists are somehow different. We're interested to hear why, but the reality is we haven't seen it yet. Let's give you some analysis as why we don't think that they're different. We don't think they're different because 5 to 10% is not prohibitive. You still are able to gamble that the $100 you spent on a Salvador Dali painting that was one of his first might possibly be someone who became really famous when you can then sell that $100 painting for a very large amount of money. And yes, maybe 5 to 10% of your very large amount of money goes back to that artist. But that doesn't stop you making a $100 investment early in that artist's career. And the reality is that's the gamble you make now, when you do exactly what Seb said you do and buy up lots and lots of different artworks in the hope that some of those individuals will become famous enough for you to get the benefit of that investment. We think this is the exact same kind of speculation that those groups will do, and the exact same speculation that a publishing house does when it offers small upfront payments to authors for them to put their books into that publishing house, have them published, and have the publishing house and that author able to profit from the future success of that work of art. We think that should also be true for works of art that are not quite so literary. Let's move on to my positive material and let's talk about forgeries. If you care about the value of the art market, and if you care as we do on our side about the quality of the art market and the art within it, then you should be very, very concerned about the number of art-selling houses that have been accused in recent years of faking paintings from modernist artists or faking paintings from post-modernist artists. We think the additional benefit that our model gives is the capacity to register that artwork and the guarantee that when you sell that artwork on, you check in with that artist or someone representing them. The reality is that gives a guarantee that artwork is likely to be real, and we think there are two reasons for that. The first is that the artist has an incentive to ensure that that is the case, because the artist benefits from a reputation as a credible artist, that the works on the market are of high quality and are therefore worth investing in. We think the second incentive operates are those who are purchasing. So when you go and decide that you want to purchase a Salvador Dali painting, you're unlikely to purchase it without the veracity of knowing that some of that money is going back to him or back to his estate, because that is what guarantees to you that the painting you are purchasing or the sketch that you are purchasing is a genuine, original by that artist. We think what that does is ensure that if you care about the art market in general, the art market is of higher quality, and that's a benefit that flows to the kind of investors they cared about on their side as well. We think that is incredibly important in this debate. I want to end on a note. The reason Salvador Dali is not Apple is that he doesn't operate by producing millions of relatively cheap products. He operates by producing 1 or 2 products a year that are of extremely high value. When he or Picasso or any other artist for the first 10 or 20 years of their career produce those works, put the same amount of effort into them or even more effort into them, and get none of the benefit when they later become famous, that is in no way equivalent to Apple, which can run through the same model and then churn out hundreds of thousands of units once they do have that fame and that credibility. Salvador Dali or Picasso or any other artist is incapable of doing that. That's why we give them some of the percentage of the benefit that those who invested in them gain from that investment. We're proud to propose.
Thank you. We welcome the second speaker from the negative.
It is somewhat perturbing when the affirmative team don't appear to actually understand their own model. Because what we've heard is that it's essentially just copyright. But the thing is, their model is nothing like copyright. Because when I go under the status quo to buy a second-hand book at a bookshop, I don't need to send 10% of the dollar I pay to the original author of the book. What copyright protects is that it establishes a property right in the expression of an idea, the book. It doesn't give you a right to the capital gains attributed to intangible factors that come along later, like the coolness of the book. And that was the point we were making about Ferrari, and the point that that side of the house willfully chose to ignore. I have 4 points that I want to make. The first one is why the property problem doesn't exist, why authors are fairly compensated, and why their model ensures that art dealers won't be fairly compensated. The second thing I want to talk about is why it's illogical to grant property in this domain, but not in the commercial domain, even though intellectually the two things appear to be indistinguishable. Thirdly, I want to talk about how this harms the dynamics of the modern art market, and talk about the ridiculous point about forgeries, and then I want to talk about the effects this has on artists and their incentives to create more works in the future. So let's talk firstly about why the problem doesn't exist. And what we said is that under the status quo, artists have a substantial advantage in the market in that artistic goods are not fungible. If you want to buy a particular piece of art because you think it has going to gain a lot of value, the artist has a monopoly right over that production. He's the only person who can produce this art. What that means is their problem about capital imbalances doesn't make any sense because all of that capital is chasing one particular artist. But the further problem is, there's lots of art dealers with lots of capital chasing the same artist. That means that there's going to be competition between art dealers to get the piece of art. That inherently means that the price paid for the art is going to be driven up. The next thing we heard from that side of the house is that artists are incompetent and poor and therefore unable to ever get a fair price for their art. But the thing is, their model doesn't actually change that in any meaningful way. Because now you're not dealing for a set sum at the start, you're dealing for the right to an annuity to the value of that art whenever it's resold. That's still a commercial transaction, and that's still one that if all of their ideas are accepted about how incompetent these people are, which we reject, they don't actually solve, because they'll just be abused in the bargain over the price of the art. They'll say, I'm not going to give you anything for this art now, because you get an income stream. That means the problem hasn't actually been solved. The next thing, though, is that we told you, is that under the status quo, you don't actually sell everything about the painting, because you maintain control of what's particularly valuable, which is your ability to produce further art. And that means that something we don't think, that means that the artist is still receiving still receiving fair compensation, because when they sell the art, they get prestige, they get all these benefits, and they retain what's actually necessary to actualise those benefits, which is the ability to produce more art. So we think that means they are fairly compensated. And what we also like to say in this situation is that under the status quo, art dealers assume all risk in that transaction, and that's something that we think is completely legitimate. We think artists benefit from the fact that they don't assume any of the risks when they receive an upfront payment, because the art isn't necessarily going to increase in value. Art dealers make lots of gambles, and the artists are benefit from the fact they don't have to carry any of the risk about those gambles, something we think is perfectly fine. The next point they made is that apparently because art sometimes in the future sells for more, that per se means it's unfair. But we gave you clear analysis that the reason it sells for a lot more is because art dealers are doing a very, very valuable thing that we think they deserve to be fairly compensated for doing. We think that the fact that art increases in value because they identify artists who are good, because they identify potential buyers who are willing to pay a lot, and because they add to the prestige, means they actually deserve the amount of work that they put in. They deserve the resale value of the art. Their entire response to this was to say that the artist also contributes in some way to the resale value of the art, so they deserve a share of its later resale value. We don't think this is strictly correct. The first thing we'd say is artists often and can diminish the value of their art. And they gave the most obvious example, which was produce more art, which reduces the scarcity value. We think it is unfair to penalise the art dealer and remove his profits because of the fact he's assuming the risk that the artist may in fact destroy the value of his things later on. We think that's very important in this debate. We also say that we think that the proportion of the gain that has been attributed actually lies mostly in the hands of, probably 100% in the hands of the art dealer. We reject that the artist has contributed any further from this. The final point we'd say is that artists also benefit from the future production. Art dealers never benefit from the future production of artistic works because they have to compete to buy them. We think in that situation where the artist maintains the ability to produce future art, that means they shouldn't get a share of the increase in value down the line because they retain something the dealer hasn't got. Unless you say that the dealer should be able to get preemptory ability to get their share of the increased prestige from the artist by being able to buy their art, it's illogical to say the transaction should go the other way. The second thing we said is we gave you a principled analysis in this debate, because we said that property rights typically only apply to the physical good itself, and we don't give property rights in intangibles associated with them. And we said the analysis that we've given you is that in the case of Ferrari, which doesn't mass produce Ferraris, only hand produces a small number of them, we don't under the status quo allow Ferrari to get a share of the resale value of every Ferrari because they've made them more prestigious. We say that a commercial increase in value by building a brand, building awareness, advertising, making it cool, sponsoring the Oscars, is just equivalent to what an artist does, but we don't recognise in that domain. Why? Because we don't recognise intangible claims over coolness, over these things that aren't actually physical objects. We only recognise property rights in physical objects in this case, the expression of a book, i.e. the physical book, or the physical expression of a sculpture, and we think that's a logical consistency they need to try and resolve in their case. The third thing we need to talk about with them is the dynamics of the modern art market. And what I'd say is that their conception of what they want is kind of bizarre, because they said at first they wanted more art being produced, because art produces social utility, but then they said one of the harms of their model was that more art would be produced, because that's on the status quo how artists make their money. We think more art is a good thing, I'll talk about this in my split, and we want them to resolve that conflict. So let's talk about forgeries, ladies and gentlemen, because what they said is that one of the benefits of their model would be fewer forgeries because people would have an incentive to capture forgeries. This doesn't make sense, because the incentive on the artist is not to capture forgeries, because if there is a forgery, they get the value of the sale, but they don't care if someone else has a fake painting. They get prestige, they get the value of that. That never made sense. And the thing is, it also reduces the incentive on the dealer to check for forgeries, because they get a reduced share of the profit. So if we're going to talk about financial incentives to find forgeries, we think that was completely illogical. So let's talk about the dynamic effects on artists. Because what we say is that artists are the geniuses of society. They push the boundaries of artistic and social endeavour. They contribute great to the corpus of human knowledge. And what we say is that their model directly incentivises artists not to continue to produce art, which is something that we think is a harm. We say under the status quo, where you can't rely on early successes to give you all your money, where to continue to get money you have to constantly produce new art that gets bought by the market. You have to compete in a free market of artists to produce the best art. That's when we get art that pushes the boundaries of what is good of our society. That's when we get a constant production of art. We think under their system, when an early success means you can just sit on your laurels and do absolutely nothing, actually diminishes the quality of artistic competition and the quality of art that is being produced. It results in a society that doesn't have as much edgy art, as much art being produced, because people don't need to compete to maintain their competitive advantage, and that's something that we think is a harm, ladies and gentlemen. So we think that also ties into the analysis we gave you about how reducing the money going to art dealers also means that we don't have these competition pressures, because art dealers need the profits they get, and they do diminish the profits they get, to offset the losses they have by identifying minor artists and protecting them. And we think that's a harm that Seb brought to you in this debate, which wasn't responded to by that side of the House. So ultimately, where do we stand at this point of the debate? What we've shown you is that there's no principled justification to grant artists the right to the intangible things associated with the physical property they sell, and since we don't provide that also to commercial dealers, and it would be simply absurd if we did. We also told you that the problem does not exist, that there is simply that artists are fairly compensated, and there's no underproduction of art, that art dealers deserve to be fairly compensated, and that by doing so we ensure that the dynamics of the art market continue to function in a positive way. We oppose.
Thank you. And we welcome the third speaker from the Affirmative.
Madam Chair, listening to the negative case, you'd assume it was all or nothing, that value was only ever given to a piece of artwork by the dealer. Or you'd assume that the value of a piece of artwork is only the frame and the canvas and the oil that sits on it. In reality, those things are true to an extent, but the value of that artwork is done by what that artist produces after that sale occurs, and the increase in the value that comes from the prestige and reputation that that artist can continue to create, and they should deserve some reward. Just as the value of that painting is not just limited to the canvas and the frame and the oil, but is the idea and the prestige that comes from holding that idea and controlling the ability to sell it. We said that idea should be compensated and should continue to be compensated under a model that sees people derive some value from that talent and that ingenuity that they built in to the frame and the canvas and the oil. So 3 points to look at this debate through. Firstly, the bargaining position of artists and whether or not they're at a disadvantage or an advantage. Secondly, whether or not in light of that they deserve a cut, or whether or not the dealers should control 100% of the resale value. And thirdly, the effect of that on the art market. So firstly, the bargaining position of artists. We've heard that the dealer is taking a risk. This belies the fact that overwhelmingly, the dealer is buying a piece of artwork that will probably never go down in value. Ultimately, they buy some expensive artwork from time to time, but the vast majority of artwork they purchase is from the artist who does not have access to that prestige. They're buying that value up when it is at its cheapest. That is when the artist has not been discovered, when they can buy hundreds of paintings from hundreds of different artists, because there's almost zero cost, because they are literally just paying the cost of those materials, because that artist has no leverage. So, because you told us that dealers are able to control that value and are able to display it in ways and build up scarcity and display it to certain people, and that generates the value, dealers are in the position to control which artwork has the value and doesn't have the value. So they have the leverage over an artist who is not able to do that when they're first releasing a piece of work. And this is exactly why your analysis about this prestige bonus fell down. For all of Gemma's material, you've yet to respond to about why that prestige is hard to calculate and hard to predict for an artist that does not have that prestige, does not have artwork being sold, and does not have any ability to calculate that accurately. We said that for artists who already have prestige, and that prestige is well known and well valued by the market, it can be priced into that initial sale, and people can account for that transaction cost. But for people who have no ability to realise what that prestige is, who have no ability to calculate what their future artwork is going to be used, they need the protection of our model so that they will have access to that true value of their creation when that value is realised.
We're yet to hear any analysis about the ability to foresee that value and why it's limited when artists don't have access to that prestige. We told you there were difficulties from the position of sale and the time of sale to calculate whether or not that artwork was going to go up or down in value, or whether or not you would turn out to have the prestige that would generate the value for that dealer. But maybe it's because they can control scarcity rather, and this was the further analysis of the negative team. We said you couldn't control that scarcity if you needed a sale. You couldn't control that scarcity if your living and income determined upon your ability to sell artwork regardless of the price being willing to take by the small number of art dealers and the large number of competing artists who don't have a better or worse necessary claim to prestige, because neither of you have an established market or an established reputation on which you can fairly compete. So you need to get that sale in order to exist in a market in which there are many people like you and not many people in a position to buy. But we told you this gives an incentive to protect that value in the long run. So not produce a heap of art necessarily unless it's good quality and likely to further your reputation and derive future value. Because it works in the buyer's incentive if you encourage artists to control their artwork and control their reputation and best ensure that that artwork reflects its true value. Not just produce as much oil on as many canvases as possible because you need that money and that income to live. We said an ability to have a stake in that future value and ability to control that value works in both people's interests. Because where an artist continues to work and develop their reputation and continues to add value to their reputation and their prestige, that extra work needs to be priced in and accounted for the person whose profits are going to go up when they resell the original piece of artwork they bought for a pittance. So secondly, do they deserve a cut? We heard that only the physical elements that people produce should be priced in. We told you that the physical function and value of that talent is represented through a piece of artwork on a piece of canvas. The actual value that goes into that canvas is not because of some inherent chemical balance that goes into the frame, but is in the utility of that artwork and the function of that oil on canvas. And the reputational and the benefits that come from that have been priced into that creation that you've made. It is not literally just about the things that you put into it. But then we heard, if that were true, we'd have to price in the coolness of Ferraris and iPods. Well, that's because they're replicatable. So even if you don't produce 1 million Ferraris, you can produce a lot more Ferraris than you can pieces of famous artwork, which by definition has to be unique in order for it to derive value to look at. But that analysis isn't true for iPods. You can produce as many of those as you like. You have an incentive to distribute to them as many people as possible. And in fact, if someone else wants to distribute iPods or something similar or relies upon the idea that you created and put into iPods, they have to pay you for that. In the same way as things like sports tickets to events that are closed doors, things like books and music are all things that have value because of their uniqueness and because there is a limited number of those things in existence, and those ideas are hard to derive and don't exist in a spread or an ability to run them off in as higher qualities. You have to reflect the value of the thing that the other people are valuing within it, and that is the prestige and value of the creation, not just the things that you put into that creation in order to present it. Then we heard that the value changes not necessarily proportionate to things that the artist does, and therefore they don't deserve a cut of that increased value. We said increasing and retaining an incentive to do so was important, but Gemma told you that artists' future work will determine that, and that's important. But the final analysis here was that you don't send money to an author when you buy a book at the bookstore. We said, in reality, you do. We're just saving you the postage. Because the bookstore paid a royalty to the publisher, and the publisher will pay that royalty to the author, and that's just been priced into the final price you pay at the bottom of the book, Madam Speaker. We said that was the analysis that showed that these people are pricing in the value of that creation and are paying a cut, in spite of the fact that the publisher still derives a large amount of profit from it. But finally, what's the impact on the art market? We heard there was an incentive to make less art. We said there was an incentive to develop your reputation and make better art because you now had a stake in that reputation and in that value. So you had an incentive to preserve that value as highly as you possibly could. But we also told you that you get more diverse art. Why is this? Because the prestige of established artists is priced into that initial sale point. But it's not priced in for people who are up and coming and can't access that. So you can continue to buy paintings at a low cost from a range of different people, knowing that you'll derive so much more profit than the initial expenditure of $100 or $200 that you had to pay to access that painting in the first place. And even if you have to sacrifice 10% in the long run, it actually encourages you to go towards people that don't have an established prestige that they're going to price in to that calculation. Then we heard that forgeries are just going to be claimed by those artists because they have an incentive to do so. We told you that when you allow them to derive value from the actual paintings that exist, not the forgeries, your incentive to register that piece of artwork or claim it as your own is reduced, because you can derive a huge amount of profit from the actual painting that is going to be resold at some point in the future, and the damage that would do to your reputation would be huge. So because we told you at the start, prestige is hard to value. It's hard to value for this actor in the time frame and position that they're making that decision. And in actual fact, those dealers are at a huge advantage, and while they add some value to that painting, the artist adds a proportionate amount to the value and development of their reputation and deserves a fair say in that. Thank you.
Thanks. We invite the third speaker from the negative side.
Throughout the case of the affirmative team, they have conflated two different types of sales. One of the commercial transactions we're talking about in this debate is the initial sale from the artist to the art dealer. What they're actually doing, though, is giving the artist right of a secondary sale, right? A sale from the art dealer to other art dealers, from an art dealer to anyone else who wants to buy it. And it's that resale value which we think there is no right for the artist to control. What I'm going to do at the end of this debate is show you why, in the first sale between the artist and the art dealer, the artist is not at a significant disadvantage. Secondly, I'm going to show you why there is no principal distinction between commercial and artistic creative endeavour, to show you why their equivocation about reproducibility of Apple doesn't work in this case, because what the artist does control in perpetuity is their talent and the prestige they get from making valuable art, and why that means that they're not actually worse off, they do get the ability to profit in the long term. And thirdly, I'm going to show you why taxing art corporations basically reduces the publicity of art in a really negative way. And if you want the social value of art to be maximised, you don't do it by taxing success or not subsidising failure. Firstly, then, why artists are unfairly treated. Their basic point was this: artists are exploited by capital. Victoria, you love liberty, so you never understand how the market works, right? We understand that in some cases, it's true that if people have more money in a commercial transaction, they have a degree of power. We don't think those conditions obtain here. And why is that? The first is, the artist doesn't have an interchangeable work with any other artist. It's not like they're offering their labour to do any job that any labourer could do, right? They have a unique product which the artists want. They said, well, artists have power, but what they'll do is just buy any old sketch and make that into a Picasso. If that's what they could do, they could just sketch their own thing, right? Artists don't control the taste and the artistic sensibilities of society. What they want to do is look for artistic potential, and artists control their artistic potential over other artists. That's why I'm never going to be an artist. I just don't have that potential in me. Someone who does have that potential has control and a monopoly over that potential. What we secondarily told you, though, was that it's not like there's just one global monopoly art dealership, right? There are lots of art dealerships, and if there is someone with potential, they will all bid for that work, or for the work that person is selling, which bids the price up. What we further told you is that, and so the idea that there's some sort of initial exploitation or a power imbalance doesn't actually stack up there. But what they then told you then was the idea that there's inevitably going to be increased value for the artwork in the future, right? And so the artist and the dealers have a competitive advantage in being able to assess that risk in some way. The first thing they told you was like a flat-out contradiction. They said, look, sometimes the art goes down, sometimes the art goes up, but it inevitably goes up, so the art dealers always have an advantage. That's the point, right? What art dealerships have to do is assess potential, but they don't do that with 100% fail-proofness. So what happens is they buy a whole bunch of somewhat talented art, but only some of that is going to succeed, right? And art dealers have to bear that risk in the initial transaction between the art and the art dealer. That's the risk that the art dealers bear. That's why we think that, for example, only talented actors get a cut of the profits from the shooting, right? Once you have a proven track record like Tom Cruise, get 20% of the gross. But a new actor, like me, if I tried to act, would get $100,000 because I don't have proven potential. When I have proven my potential, that's when the artist can then leverage that back into the future artworks they sell on to different art dealers. What we've further told you is that art dealers actually do a lot of work which artists can't do, and that work is publicising the art. That work is like bearing the transactions costs of finding the particular potential art owners who want particular pieces of art. That's not something that artists are at all in a comparative advantage situation to do. What they're good at is painting the damn thing on the canvas. What the art dealers are good at doing is selling the canvas with the good painting on it to people who want to buy it. There's different works which actually increase the value of the art in the on sale, which artists have no control over and so have no moral claim to. What we've essentially shown you so far is that in the initial sale situation, there is no systematic disadvantage for artists. They get the right price for their goods at the point they sell them to the art dealer. The next question that I want to ask then is why artists are going to do fine in perpetuity because of the control they have over the ideas and their talent. Because the point here, the distinction they're trying to find, is the idea that they have anyone who sells a particular object has a right to an annuity of the resale value of that object in perpetuity. We don't think that exists. Because what we say is that what you actually have a right to is the prestige which comes along with being identified as the person who made that product. That's why our Apple example works, right? Every time if I resell my iPod that I have on the stage here to somebody else here, Apple doesn't get a cut of that my profit, right? What they do get is a cut of the prestige because I'm on selling an Apple good. And what can Apple do with that? They can use that prestige and leverage it to create newer iPods and newer iPads in the future. That's the same thing that Salvador Dali can do, right? When people on-sell his goods, which increases his prestige, which means that the next good that he produces, the next artwork that he produces, is going to be sold for more money. And it's that prestige which you can re-leverage into your next artwork, which means that you can get money. This is why their poor artist analysis doesn't work, right? Because artists take risks, obviously in the initial part of their career. They spend some money, maybe they go into debt, but if they are successful, just like in any other commercial endeavour, if they are successful, they can use their profits in the long term, or when they have become successful, to offset their costs in the short term. So then artists should have to bear that risk, and if they are successful, delivering that prestige back into them is exactly what's going to allow them to make money in the long term. And that's why, again, this idea about reproducibility doesn't work for putting this out of the house. They're trying to say, like, the reason that there's going to be a difference between like Apple iPods and Salvador Dali's painting is that you can make millions and millions of iPods. But that's not the point that we're trying to make, right? The point we're trying to make is that what you do have a right over is the prestige. Enzo Ferrari and his family gets money every time someone else buys a Ferrari, every time the Ferraris are mentioned in pop culture, and that's what allows them to continue to make profits in the long term. He has the right and the identity over the particular thing he makes, but he doesn't have a right to the annuity or the resale value of that particular object. That's what they haven't understood, and that's why there's no principal distinction they've been able to draw between different types of creative, innovative behaviour. Lastly then, why does taxing art corporations reduce the publicity of art in the long term? We gave you a really simple piece of analysis at the start of this debate, right? Art dealers have to spend money on lots of things. Some of them fail, some of them succeed. What they're doing is taxing the stuff that succeeds without subsidising the stuff that fails, which means that art dealers have less money to redirect into purchasing more art in the future. Because that's what they're doing, right? If you have a successful art piece which you can sell for $10 million, you now only get $9 million or $9.5 million. That's $500,000 to $1 million less to then sell, buy the next set of art. And what they do when they buy the next set of art isn't just give money to rich individuals. They try and build a flourishing arts culture. They have less money to do that under their side of the house. That's what they never understood when they said you only sacrifice 10%. That's marginally 10% less money direct to the publicity of art. That's a harm of their model. What we further told you at Richard is that artists should have an incentive to rest on their laurels that succeed early in their career. Artists are the creative geniuses of society. We want to make sure that there's incentive structures in place for them to leverage their own creative genius in the most productive way possible for society. That means that they should, if they are a good artist, make one good art piece, have them recognized as a good art piece, but then be spurred on to create more and newer art pieces in the future. That's why we think it's good they keep chucking down oil on canvas again and again and again. Because they're not going to make the same thing. You're going to try different patterns of oil on different types of canvases with different types of speckling or whatever people do, right? I don't really know. But that's the thing. They take risks and they're forced to take risks and they're spurred to take risks when they have to make, basically innovate, create, or jump. That's a good thing. The last ridiculous point about